I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us for our worship service here at the First Unitarian Church in Salt Lake City. Today we're really going to shake up our usual liturgy, and I want to thank our worship team for their support. They have kindly stepped aside for this service, giving me the full run on a subject that is very dear to my heart, yet fills me with rage and humiliation. In our time together today, we might just barely scratch the surface of the emotional trials and physical roadblocks that Black artists had to confront throughout our nation's history. It was not only a matter of racism, but also the arrogance of establishing an artistic canon exclusively within the impenetrable boundaries of a white culture. It's not enough to merely showcase the Black artists who refused to be dismissed by those who focused exclusively on their own Eurocentric culture. Instead, I hope we can gain a deeper appreciation for the Black artistic voices that found expression during the Harlem Renaissance, the Black arts movement, and our contemporary scene today. Now, this would not be an easy task for anyone, especially for an older white male. This has proven to be a bit of a personal journey for me, learning on a visceral level what we have all come to understand intellectually. Our self-proclaimed progressive outlook does not exempt us from being part of the social structures that support white supremacy. Even my personal journey as a youngster, growing up in an all-Black neighborhood in Queens on the wrong side of the Long Island Railroad tracks, not even this can save me from any racist allegations. You know, as bizarre as it seemed, I was bused with my Black friends to a white school in grades 5 and 6. I lost 2 good friends to an overdose of heroin in junior high and learned firsthand of the healing powers of the Black church. Although my early years were energized by Black mentors whom I loved with all my heart, I got my first real wake-up call in my teens. I was in college in New York City, right in the middle of a period in history known as the Black Arts Movement, which spanned the decade from 1965 to 1975. Now, I graduated college in 1972 and was only one class shy of minoring in contemporary art history. I spent almost all my waking hours in art museums. Black artists were simply erased from the museums and galleries. But here's my humiliation. It never struck me as odd. Why would it? You know, it wasn't until 2016 that the black artist Kerry James Marshall had the first ever retrospective of a living black artist. 2016. It was in the Metropolitan Breuer Museum. Black artists were invisible in cultural venues meant for white audiences only. The gatekeepers to the present-day world of curating art and establishing programs for the public, they're now being challenged, rigorously challenged by black artists and black administrators who insist that change happen now, immediately. Big change. And we're just beginning now to see new evidence of broadening the cultural perspective. Ballet West is reaching out to black dancers. The Museum of Fine Arts on the university campus here is currently running a blockbuster of an exhibit called Black Refractions. And symphony orchestras around the country are making efforts to become more diverse. These are but small examples of change. We need to understand that precluding an entire race from its cultural narrative reflects the most insidious form of racism. The art world might as well have had signs posted that said, "For whites only." White people miss the violence done to black artists. You know, it's a different kind of violence from the obvious brutality of slavery extending back more than 400 years. We need to understand violence on a social and psychic level as well, caused by erasing from society the black artistic consciousness. Toni Morrison described artists as those who manifest what they believe is true and verifiable. We hunger for a way to articulate who we are and what meaning we bring to the table to be shared with others. White society was essentially saying that there was no truth at all, expressed in the voices of black artists. Our service today hopes to present the Harlem Renaissance in terms of its meaning for black artists who had been intentionally cut off from any cultural conversation. We will then take another look at that period in our history during the 60s and 70s when the black empowerment movement captured the imagination of many African Americans, including artists. Then hopefully we'll come to appreciate the present-day voice of black artists as they just break open the canon of white culture. The Harlem Renaissance went from about 1918 until the mid-1930s. Stride piano was pretty big back then, but it was nothing like the blues.
Without a word of warning, blues walked in this morning and circled around my lonely room. I didn't know why I had the sad, lonely feeling till my baby called and said we're through. Oh, yes, she did.
Dr. Martin Luther King addressed the opening of the 1964 Jazz Festival in Berlin. He said, "God has wrought many things out of oppression. He has endowed his creatures with the capacity to create. And from this capacity has flowed the sweet songs of sorrow and joy that have allowed man to cope with his environment and many different situations. Jazz speaks to life. The blues tell the stories of life's difficulties. And if you think for a moment, you will realize that they take the hardest realities of life and put them into music, only to come out with some new hope or a sense of triumph. This is triumphant music. Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play. And so begins the poem Weary Blues by one of the great poets from the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. I heard a Negro play down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of an old gaslight. He did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. His ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues! Swaying to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, raggy tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues. In a deep song voice, with a melancholy tone, I heard that Negro sing that old piano moan. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself. I was gonna quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf. Thump, thump, thump went his foot on the floor. He played a few chords, then he sang some more. I got the weary blues, and I can't be satisfied. Got the weary blues and can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more, and I wish that I had died. And far into the night he crooned that tune. The stars went out, and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock, or a man that's dead. Weary Blues was the title poem in Langston Hughes' book of poems, published in 1926. Now, Harlem was clearly a final destination for the largest number of African Americans fleeing the racist conditions of the Jim Crow South in what is known as the Great Migration. Following a brief period of freedom during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, Southerners set their sights on regaining power. From 1890 to 1908, they passed legislation that disenfranchised most African Americans, trapping them without any representation. I think we may be repeating this tendency again in these days of sanctioned racism. We need to understand that most of the African American population that settled into Harlem at that time, they actually arose from a generation that had memories of both the gains and losses of Reconstruction. And we need to fully comprehend that those that were now in Harlem, they had parents and grandparents who were slaves. But now they were all gathered up together in Harlem, hoping for a better life and also for a chance of self-expression in the arts. Now, for me personally, one of the more powerful poems to emerge from the Harlem Renaissance was written in 1927 by Claude McKay, articulating a simmering anger that can still be recognized and discerned today. The poem is called If We Must Die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain, that even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. Imagine what it must have felt like being part of the mix in Harlem in the 1920s. There had to have been a lot of hope. The NAACP was founded in 1909, the National Urban League in 1910, the ACLU in 1920, and culturally it was all happening at once. The Renaissance placed a black signature on music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, and politics, all centered in Harlem. You know, one can get breathless just thinking about it. So who were the artists at that time trying to break onto the scene controlled by a largely hostile white establishment? As Courtney Isaiah Smith plays a composition written in 1930 for the Cotton Club on 125th Street, let's take a look at the art.
Don't know why there's no sun up in the sky, stormy weather. Since my man and I ain't together, keeps raining all of the time. Oh yeah, life is bad, gloom and misery everywhere, stormy weather.
In 1926, Langston Hughes set the tone for the next great era of black artists giving voice to the black experience in this country. His essay, not a poem, mind you, this is now an essay called "The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain," insisted that black artists resist external attempts to control their art. The truly great black artist, wrote Langston Hughes, will be the one who can fully embrace and freely express his blackness. What an extraordinary challenge back in 1926. It took almost 40 years for that challenge, admonition perhaps, to take root. The Harlem Renaissance lacked much of the political fervor inherent in what it means to express one's blackness. The Black Arts Movement was the name given to a group of politically motivated black poets, artists, dramatists, musicians, and writers who emerged in the wake of the Black Power movement. The poet Amiri Baraka, formerly known as Leroy Jones, is considered the father of the Black Arts Movement. It called for the creation of poetry, novels, visual arts, and theater to reflect pride, enormous pride in black history and black culture. They emphasized autonomy of black artists to create black art for black people as a means to awaken black consciousness and achieve liberation. This was especially important for many black poets who were infuriated by having their poems sandpapered. This is how they referred to publishers who toned down their poems to make them more suitable for a white audience. Poems were sandpapered. The Black Arts Movement lasted 10 years, beginning with the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. Grieving deeply, Amiri Baraka wrote a poem for black hearts. It went like this in part. For Malcolm's eyes, when they broke the face of some dumb white man, for Malcolm's hands raised to bless us of ourselves, for Malcolm's words fire darts, the victor's tireless thrusts, words hung above the world, change as it may. He said it, and for this he was killed, for saying and feeling and being change, all collected hot in his heart. And women poets like June Jordan added their rage several years later as black neighborhoods in New York, Newark, Detroit, Watts went up in flames. Now, she wrote in part, "How many of my brothers and my sisters will they kill before I teach myself retaliation? Shall we pick a number? South Africa, for instance, do we agree that more than 10,000 in less than a year, but that less than 5,000 slaughtered in more than 6 months will..." What is the matter with me? I must become a menace to my enemies. Artists aligned with the black liberation struggle, which emphasized self-reliance, black control of business organizations, agencies, institutions. It's hard to believe now, but it wasn't until 1969 that the first black history course was taught on the college level. It wasn't until 1974 that the few black students at Harvard Divinity School began to organize and question the administration about the lack of any black representation. In 1968, the Studio Museum in Harlem was founded. They are responsible for this traveling exhibit called Black Refractions, shown now at the Museum of Fine Arts on the U of U campus. One of the hopes of the Studio Museum was to alter art history in America. What an objective. In fact, the first exhibit in the Studio Museum of Harlem was called Invisible Americans. It was organized in 1968 in response to a Whitney Museum survey of American art that completely omitted any work by an African American artist. It's no wonder I didn't know there were black artists, despite being an art history student in New York in the 1960s. The black arts movement began to fade when Baraka and other leaders moved further left and embraced Marxism. This shift alienated many artists and mainstream black businessmen as well. But regardless, the black arts movement left behind many timeless and stirring pieces of literature, poetry, theater. One of my favorite poems from this era is by Nikki Giovanni. If I can't do what I want to do, then my job is to not do what I don't want to do. It's not the same thing, but it's the best I can do. If I can't have what I want, then my job is to want what I've got and be satisfied that at least there's something more to want. And since I can't go where I need to go, then I must go where the signs point, though always understanding parallel movement isn't lateral. When I can't express what I really feel, I practice feeling what I can express, and none of it is equal, I know. But that's why mankind alone among the animals, learns to cry. I think Nikki Giovanni renders a most, well, in some sense, gentle, and at the same time, fierce understanding of racism. It's not just the overt discrimination, but a deeply piercing realization imposed on people of color where they must practice feeling what they're permitted to feel while they are prohibited to express what they really feel. Not many in white society have a clue as to what that means, or can even come close to understanding the anguish resulting from being constrained to express what one feels. Dr. King made a connection with his Berlin audience by linking jazz to liberation. He said, "Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from this music. It has strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail. It has claimed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down. And now jazz is exported to the world. For in the particular struggle of the Negro in America, there is something akin to the universal struggle of modern man. Everybody has the blues. Everybody longs for meaning. Everybody needs to love and be loved. Everybody longs for faith. In music, especially this broad category called jazz, there is a stepping stone towards all of these. I've held back on one artist from the Black Arts movement, and she's probably the most famous artist of all, Faith Ringgold. She's now 89 years old, and she is painting again. There was a hiatus, but she is painting again today, inspired anew after the murder of George Floyd. She's hoping and praying that his death becomes a catalyst that would turn the tides of social justice. I can't imagine, she said. I can't imagine what he did to deserve to die. His breath was stolen by a system that threatens our freedom. Faith Ringgold provides a helpful transition from the Black Arts movement right now into our contemporary era. Now, caught up in the political art that dominated the scene from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s, she painted All Power to the People, did that in 1970. She said, if you don't get out there, nothing will change. One of her most recognized paintings is from the American People series, it's number 20, called Die. Her canvas portrays a race riot and was inspired by Picasso's Guernica. Picasso was depicting the horrible violence during the Spanish Civil War. Anti-war art has kind of become a genre in itself. Now, this Ringgold painting has made such a huge impression that it hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York today, right next to Picasso's Guernica. The intent to make black artists more visible represents a huge shift in how art is now being curated. And when the Metropolitan Museum of Art reopens following the pandemic, Ringgold will be on view in celebrating the 150th anniversary of the museum. It's a 1985 work called Street Story Quilt. Edging into the contemporary era, in 1997, Ringgold painted "We Came to America." You can see in this picture, African Americans are drowning in New York Harbor. The face of the Statue of Liberty is Ringgold's own face, and that includes the dreadlocks we see on Lady Liberty. Ringgold's art is being shown internationally, both in London at the Tate and in Sweden. We're finally breaking open the canon of Western culture to include the voices of black artists, playwrights, poets, and dancers. The journey of inclusion has been a long one, from Langston Hughes igniting the spark for black artists to speak to black audiences, then to the politics of the 1960s and 70s, where liberation also meant myriad interpretations of black power. The struggle for visibility, inclusion, and acceptance has always run deep through the black arts community. Now we can look at some samples. Titus Kaffir, in his Jarreau series, aims to bring visibility to black subjects who are historically absent from Western art history. He challenges how history is written and recorded. The tar that you see, the tar is symbolic of the material history and wealth built at the expense of black lives. Then we have "Give Us a Poem" by artist Glenn Ligon. The text was taken from a 1975 speech by Muhammad Ali. When asked to give his audience a poem, Ali replied, "Me, we." It's probably the shortest poem ever, but he imbued these words with the might of an era defined by collective activism and also underscoring the need for one's own self-identity. Now, me, we. "Silence is Golden" is a chilling work by Kerry James Marshall. It was inspired by Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man. We note here a black figure with a very dark background calling attention to the easy invisibility of African Americans. It represents a common racist attitude stemming from stereotypical depictions of African Americans. The figure is pressing two fingers against his lips as if sushing us. What is meant here? Is he trying to tell us to keep quiet now that we noticed his presence? And finally, perhaps my favorite depiction of black invisibility is this piece called "Houseboy" by the Nigerian artist Octobon Nkanga. It's a watercolor where she makes a study on the intersection of humans, objects, and labor. Houseboy depicts a multitasking body with two extra arms, making up for an absent torso and head. And just the term houseboy has a troubled history. And here she shows a figure whose sole value and existence is conferred upon it through the completion of domestic tasks. Painted in 2004, the artist attempts to make the point that chattel slavery has never actually ended. Well, slavery is not all that hasn't ended. Here's a powerful poem by one of today's leading poets Claudia Rankine. And this was written last year, in the year 2020, when we were all scrambling, I dare say desperate, in the upcoming presidential election. It's amazing the perspective that she gives on that frightful time. On a scrap of paper in the archive is written, "I have forgotten my umbrella." Turns out in a pandemic, everyone, not just the philosopher, is without. We scramble in the drought of information held back by inside traders, drop by drop. Face covering? No. Yes. Social distancing? 6 feet under for underlying conditions, black. Just us and the blues kneeling on a neck with the full weight of a man in blue. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. In extremis, I can't breathe gives way to asphyxiation, to giving up this world, and then mama call to, a call to protest, fire, glass. Say their names, say their names. White silence equals violence. The violence of again. A militarized police forced tear gassing, bullets ricochet, and civil unrest. Taking it, burning it down. Whatever contracts keep us social compel us now to disorder the disorder. Peace. We're out to repair the future. There's an umbrella by the door, not for yesterday, but for the weather that's here. I say weather, but I mean a form of governing that deals out death and names it living. I say weather, but I mean a November that won't be held off. This time, nothing, no one forgotten. We are here for the storm that's storming because what's taken matters. Let's sample a few of the artists who are in the midst of the storm today. You know, there really is no conclusion to this service today. We are in the middle of change with only some guesses as to where black voices will will take art from here out into the future. What does this all mean for us, black and white? What does it mean for art? And good heavens, what does this all mean for our nation? We can get a glimpse of this in our closing words, a closing poem by Amanda Gorman.
While once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens, but one thing is certain. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the west. We will rise from the wind-swept northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked south. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.